Why couldn't that happen to me? What would happen to my children under those circumstances? Very shortly, I'll be introducing legislation to prevent the unlawful detention of U.S. citizens and legal permanent residents. The problem with our detention system is even larger. Beyond the U.S. citizens and permanent residents who are unlawfully detained, there are people who have come to the United States fleeing persecution, people who have committed no crime, but find themselves trapped and squeezed between the gears of the U.S. immigration system. The Washington Post has recently run a disturbing series on the catastrophic state of our detention system. And I encourage all of my colleagues to read it, and I ask unanimous consent at this time to enter those articles into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
The whole series is staggering, revealing deficiencies in our detention system that most of us couldn't dream up in our worst nightmare. The Washington Post has forced us as a nation to look in the mirror, and I, for one, am appalled at what I see. We, the United States of America, the greatest democracy in the entire world, would be injecting people with heavy dosages of drugs in order to deport them or just to move them around the system with more ease. Immigration officials drug people going through U.S. facilities, and they drug people who are to be deported. They drug some people so heavily that when they get off the plane, they collapse on the tarmac or have to be rolled off the plane in a wheelchair. They don't only drug people to make it easier to kick them out. One story that stood out in both the Washington Post and a segment on 60 Minutes was that of a woman named Amina Moody. Last year, Amina fled from Somalia to the United States to seek asylum after she was tortured and her family was killed before her eyes. When she arrived at JFK Airport, she was shackled, thrown in a van, and driven to a windowless converted warehouse in New Jersey. Immigration authorities didn't so much as find an interpreter. Instead, they decided to lock her up, decided she was insane without even talking to her, and decided to inject her full of a drug to treat a disease she didn't even have. And the side effects were awful. Her tongue swelled so much she couldn't close her mouth. She drooled and vomited uncontrollably and began to lactate. And when she complained, they upped the dose. She thought to herself, maybe I am going to die here. Finally, 5 months after she was detained, she won her asylum case in court and was released from the detention center. Without the perseverance of her lawyer, Amina would never have emerged from her drug-induced state. She would never have found the asylum she so desperately needed. This case sheds light on another grim reality. Medical treatment at our detention facilities is atrocious. Over-medication is far from the only problem. Life-threatening lack of care is also a serious problem. Take the heartbreaking story of Francisco Castaneda. Francisco entered one of our detention facilities battling cancer, although he didn't know it at the time. All he knew is that he had significant lesions on his reproductive organs. Off-site officials who never examined Francisco repeatedly denied him the biopsy he so desperately needed. After 11 long months in custody, Francisco argued for and eventually obtained a temporary release so he could pay for his own biopsy. Life-threatening cancerous tumors were found. Despite amputation of the affected area and several rounds of chemotherapy, Francisco died of cancer at the age of 36. A federal judge recently noted that this case appears to present, quote, one of the most, if not the most, egregious Eighth Amendment violations involving cruel and unusual punishment the court has ever encountered. The United States of America essentially killed Francisco Castaneda by denying him the medical care he so desperately needed. Why? Because he had entered this country without the proper documentation at the age of 10, when his mother, fleeing civil war in El Salvador, a war the United States helped to fund, a war which sent thousands of refugees like him to our country, chose to seek freedom. He was denied care because he tried to make a better life for himself and his family. These are hardly offenses that warrant death. We cannot in good conscience allow these conditions to continue, and that's why I've joined together with my colleagues, Senators Kennedy, Durbin, Akaka, and Lieberman, to introduce the Detainee Basic Medical Care Act. First, the bill would require the Department of Homeland Security to establish procedures for delivering basic health care to all immigrant detainees in custody. It requires the department to give people in custody access to any medications they urgently need, both during detention and transfers. Currently, a bureaucrat in an office can overrule a medical professional who is actually on site and seeing a detainee. This bill ensures that treatment decisions are made by the professionals who actually see the patient. And finally, the bill would require the department to report all detainee deaths to the Office of the Inspector General in Congress. Madam President, we can never lose sight of the fact that everyone who immigrates to this country, whether they are documented or not, is a human being. A detention should never amount to a death sentence. This kind of action to ensure humane treatment and prevent unnecessary deaths at these facilities is long overdue. Let us not forget that many in immigration detention are there for minor violations, many because of administrative errors or pending legitimate asylum cases. At this point, this becomes more than a legal issue. It becomes a human rights issue. And it is our job to do all we can to secure our country while also protecting the dignity of all human beings. If we fail to do so, not only do we blemish ourselves, but we lose the moral high ground to be a beacon of democracy and a leader in human rights around the world. It is astounding to me that human beings could be treated as badly as some are being treated on our soil. When innocent people are drugged, tranquilized, and treated like animals. When agents attempt to handcuff a pregnant United States citizen, break down the door to her home, terrify her children and her family. When an agency of the federal government deports its own citizen. When all of this is going on, each of us in America has to think, what is happening in our country? Doesn't my United States citizenship, whether by birth or naturalization, protect me from this kind of abuse? Now, some officials have claimed that these incidents are rare, and some have suggested this is acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of undocumented aliens. Tell that to our fellow citizens who found themselves either detained illegally or deported. Tell that to Pedro and Gladys and Amina and everyone else and all the families who have had to watch this happen. And no matter how widespread this pattern of abuse turns out to be, one thing is clear. It isn't rare enough. There is only one way to prevent that kind of abuse, and it should be a universal policy that before we accuse someone of being undocumented, there's one other document we should inspect first. It's called the Constitution of the United States. It's time for immigration and law enforcement at all levels to rededicate themselves to respecting the rights that the Constitution guarantees. And that means respecting the need for probable cause and the right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure guaranteed by the Fourth Amendment, the right to due process guaranteed by the Fifth Amendment, the full benefits of citizenship and equal protection for anyone born or naturalized in this country guaranteed by the 14th Amendment, and the entire range of rights and protections under our Constitution. It's going to take real leadership at every level of our justice system, from the Attorney General to the Secretary of Homeland Security on down. That's the only way that those who by birth or naturalization have a legitimate right to pursue the American dream and to make sure that their lives don't turn into an un-American nightmare. Madam President, this issue might not be the legislative business of the Chamber at this moment, but it is always our moral business. It is always our moral business to defend the most fundamental principle on which our nation was founded, that all of us are created equal. Stopping illegal detentions of Americans based on their race is about more than properly enforcing the law. Above all, it's about respecting people who may be different from us, but who share the same birthright. Martin Luther King said, "We may have come on different ships, but we're all in the same boat now." And if we're worried about what to throw off that boat, it should be our oldest enemy, which is fear. Once that's gone, we can resume our course on the currents of freedom and let our sails be filled with liberty and justice for all. We can preserve the Constitution, defend our borders, and at the same time make sure that no American citizen, whether naturalized or born here, ever faces the discrimination that is taking widespread across the country in ways in which they are illegally detained, illegally put in detention facilities, their houses are broken into, and where even a United States citizen could be deported. That is a shameful time in our history, and I hope that the Senate will work to stop it. To the extent I have any balance in my time, I yield it to Senator Durbin for his presentation. And I yield.